So one of the main themes that I picked up on that I thought was one of the most important in the novel was the idea that words and language are completely inadequate to attempt even to describe a spiritual experience.
Maybe especially.
To another person or even oneself. And as an author, using the very same inadequate language to talk about this, what was that like?
Well, I tried to remember it a lot, that everything I was writing was going to be inadequate, and it was only going to show a particular slice of what was going on. It could never show the whole thing. It's one of the things that the character Moses struggles with, because he sees these different interpretations of this experience that he's had, and he's trying to figure out what that experience really was. Was it really that clear as his elder son Gershom would have it? Or was it much more fuzzy and open to interpretation? Now, I happen to believe that if there's a God who is worth believing in, that God shouldn't be able to fit into my narrow categories of understanding and into my language. And so whatever I say or think or feel about God, I always know that it's never going to be perfectly true. It's only the best I can do at the moment. Mm-hmm. And that's a part of the religious process of growth, I guess I would say, is how we take our words in describing something and put it together with the experience that we remember. And we can work really hard to try to find better words to describe things, but they're never going to be complete. One of the people I studied in my schooling was Carl Jung, and Jung often made the point that a good symbol is something that does not replace what it represents, but it points beyond itself to really an inexpressible reality. And I think all of our symbols, our words are symbols, and our rituals are symbols, and they try to point beyond themselves to give us a broader experience, but they can never perfectly represent what that reality is.
Right. So you've said that this story is not primarily a religious one. What do you mean by that?
Well, this is about a group of people who were in slavery for many hundreds of years, really, as the biblical story goes. And then they are brought out of there. And they go into a place where they really don't know the rules. They don't know how they're going to survive. And that seems to me to be a very human activity. You know, it's something we all face sometimes. Sometimes it's because of choices that we've made that we find ourselves facing all kinds of new questions in life. And sometimes it's because stuff just happens. People die, or people get sick, or people lose jobs, or people move where they don't feel as comfortable with the culture just because it's unfamiliar. And so we all have that experience of how we become a community in the midst of a crisis. So even without the idea of God in there at all, that's a very important story to be told. Another layer of this has to do with justice issues. One of the things that happens in my story as they're coming out of the wilderness and getting ready to go into the promised land is that the power relationship between the men and the women changes. In the wilderness, they really had to work as a team. And the women's functions were very important, every bit as important as the men's, although they might have been different. And there was a sense of equality, equality of purpose and equality of function. As they're getting closer to the promised land and to the expectations that they have about what that's supposed to give them, they start worrying about ownership and stuff. And women and children are then treated more like property than they are treated like valuable members of the community. So that's another thing that we see all the time. In this country, when World War II happened, there were all kinds of women who went into the workforce. They weren't even particularly prepared for it because they hadn't expected to have to do that, but then the situation was there, and they did the job. And then when the war was over, when the crisis was over, many of them were forced back into more subservient roles in their families. Now, and that wasn't about God, although I suppose some people tried to use religious language to enforce it, but it was about the difference between living in a time when survival and working together was really important, and then living in a time when accumulating stuff and improving your standard of living became more important, and that made the power relationship between the genders much more unequal. We can talk about violence as an answer to problems in the world. And yeah, I suppose there are times when violence seems inevitable, but it always comes with a great cost. And that's another of the themes that gets talked about quite a bit in this story. Is it necessary to be violent in order to inherit your rightful place in the world? That's a tough question, and it's a question that we just have to pick up the newspaper any morning or go online and look at the news and see that human beings are still struggling with that question of the right place of violence in our relationships and in our society.